Hello, this is Ellen Madono speaking to you from Polarity Analysis. Hello, this is Ellen Madono speaking to you from Tokyo Homeopathy. I think you're here because you know that polarity analysis is the easiest way for beginners to get a feeling for homeopathy, because you get the remedy right much more often than you would otherwise. And you must have some intuition that the checklist is the key to opening the door to polarity analysis. That's why you want to make the checklist your list. Good thinking. I hope all of you have made your own polarity analysis account. And if you're members of a local group that belongs to my group, then you are downloading the checklist that I have made, because I've simplified this a little bit for you. You should receive an invitation to Bubble Up. And if you open up the folders there, you will see two documents. One is a questionnaire with some added information, and the other is some creative uses of the questions, since you'll have many different kinds of cases that will use the questionnaire. When you click on the document, right-click again, and you will be able to download it. Please print out the questionnaire for this lecture. First, we're going to cover what you are going to tell your patient about the checklist. First of all, it's a short questionnaire, only about 100 questions, and you don't ask all of them. The questions are based on scholarly research, so they are reliable. Now, this piece of advice that you should distinguish between normal and crisis reactions by your patient is something you'll have to repeat over and over again throughout the session. You need to know how the patient feels to find the remedy. Reactions to weather, body position, vision, food, sleep, all of these things are covered by the questionnaire. But everything you could possibly ask is not covered. It's a very limited set of information. It's only about daily habits that are really necessary for survival. So when you start the checklist interview, you're going to keep repeating. What's the difference between your normal reaction and this reaction during the crisis that we're looking for a remedy to help you with? The questionnaire consists mainly of what homeopaths call modalities. This means what makes you feel better or worse. The checklist is basically the organization that you see on the screen here. And first, we are going to cover weather reactions. Modalities are all about the human body maintaining the same conditions despite changes in the environment. This is called, by physiologists, homeostasis. Stasis means the same, static. Homeo means the same, as in homeopathy. Here we are looking for crisis responses. In this case, when you're cold, you shiver to warm yourself up. And when you're hot, you perspire. This familiar cartoon character gets the hot stimulus, and he begins to respond. Homeostasis is all about feedback. So when it becomes hot, the brain produces a response to sensors of heat throughout the body. And it responds by producing sweat. This is what's called a feedback system. In the same way, if it becomes cold, the brain responds to stimulus throughout the body and begins to produce shivering as a response. This is what we are calling homeostasis. Responses to weather are in the checklist very limited. How do you feel when something is warm or cold applied to your body in one small spot, as in this case? How do you feel when the wind is blowing through a window? Do you like fresh air? How do you feel about heat from an outside source? How about dampness? How much clothing do you need? There are many more questions you could ask about responses to weather, but the checklist limits these because this is what Bowenhausen first discovered to be the most strongly suggestive of the remedy that needs to be taken as medicine. Dr. Fry has used his own experience, and if you open up the software, you will see that these rubrics here, these symptoms here, are highlighted in yellow. It means that you should directly ask the patient. You could even read the question to the patient if you need to. I look at the whole section and make it fit into the flow of the conversation with the patient. You can do that gradually as you get used to it. These symptoms that you see here can be found in the pocketbook repertory of Bowenhausen. This is a picture taken from my computer, and this is how it looks. Taking a case mostly involves listening. Even though we call this a questionnaire, it's actually a framework for listening and to improve your listening skills, because all forms of homeopathy rely mainly on listening. So when you're asking these questions, the patient or the caretaker of the patient will start telling you the story of their sickness in this case, or whatever the problem is. And it will include many more details than what is needed to fill out the questionnaire. You modulate this depending on the amount of time that you have at the moment. If the story involves other human relationships, interactions, you may hear about this, and it's often very helpful to listen to this information because it will tell you about the patient. And when you're trying to differentiate between several remedies, this is the information that you will use. Don't suppress the patient. Don't prevent the patient from talking about whatever surrounds the story of their problem. And when you are beginning the case, you want to find out first what is the chief complaint. And if you can find a crisis or a repeated crisis, it doesn't matter, that has a beginning and an end, that's very helpful because it's very difficult to take a case that covers everything about the patient. It's much easier to take a case of a crisis. Because this repertory is very deep, often you are going to be actually taking a much bigger case than the simple crisis. But you will learn about that gradually as you learn about your patient. So just let things unfold. Patients will often answer you telling you how they normally are. They take off their coat more quickly than other people, or they wear fewer clothing than other people who are colder, meaning that they're normally warm. But you, in this case, want the information about when they are sick. And if it's different than their normal information, in other words, if they're suddenly very cold, but normally they were hot-blooded, that's very good information, okay? You want to know that they are normally hot. And you want to know that now they are they're cold when they're sick. So encourage the patient to tell you about the contrast. Always keep this map in mind and keep on reminding the patient that this is what you're doing. You want to know what has changed since the crisis. Now, sometimes it helps to experiment. I use this picture to mean that you should think about experimenting. So, if the question is about dampness, or cold dampness, hot dampness, whatever, you might ask about the shower or the bath. How did it affect the cough? And often it's relevant. I have grouped questions somewhat loosely. They're not like a tight group. This one here is about cold, wet, and this one is about cold, and this one is about dampness. So it really covers both categories. But I've loosely grouped them because if you're asking about humidity and how it affects them, often it's easier to ask the abstract question of, how are you affected by humidity? And if they say, oh, I'm not much, but you later find out that, oh, your nose is irritated when it gets dry. Oh, and then you have to actually go back to this area because they told you one thing and told you something else, so you're looking for some kind of little contradiction there. These categories here might help you in the beginning. The website is not set up with clear categories like this. But always remember that when on my cheat sheet here, I have made the questions that Dr. Fry thinks you should ask directly. I have made these red. And on his website, he makes them yellow, like this, okay? Just remember that. Now again, when the patient is talking to you about some phenomena, they know about the various types of headaches, and they will be trying to tell you all the information about headaches that they know. And if they don't, you might ask a few questions about headaches in general, even if they're not on the questionnaire. But if you have time, and if they want to talk about that, encourage them to talk as they see fit. Even though you're talking about humidity and they stray off the path, allow that because you really want to know the whole story. You don't just want to know the narrow questionnaire story. Unless you're in a huge hurry. That happens also. If they begin to talk about some problem that isn't on the questionnaire, this is sometimes very useful, especially when you don't have enough answers. If you find a separate question, a separate problem, you actually can take a case based on two problems when you're lacking enough symptoms. So if they begin talking about their eye problem along with the headache, and it's a dry eye, which, you asked about dampness, so immediately they thought about their dry eye, put a little marker there, circle that, do something, because that could be very useful for you. When I do an interview, often the most general question is the easiest way to start, and it's not necessarily the first one that's in the list. So I eyeball the list and I go to the general one first, and then fill out the rest of the list as the conversation develops. So in this case, cold in general is easy to ask. And then you find out whether they have these special conditions of weather being cold and wet, or warm air affects them more. So air would be something that's blowing. It could be wind as well. And so you make these finer differentiations. And if you have a lot of fine ones, you may not want to have the general one and use the fine ones, or include them. Depends on the number of rubrics or symptoms that you have. Rubric means symptom. Okay. So you just play around with this. I actually turn them on and off. I've made other videos about that. Now, if you're talking about cold, you may get into talk about winter, feelings about winter, peculiarities that are not on the checklist. We've mentioned this. And you might want to note down some of these. You may not want to get lost in gossip about other people. It's part of the information about how they view their social life, and you want to get that, but you may not want to get too lost in it. It's very much a judgment call, how much information you want to get that is very emotional and very kind of abstract. If it's your first interview, you may want to just get to know the patient. If you don't have much time, you may not have time for that. It depends on the situation. Now, these are the kinds of situations that it can be very good to ask the patient to experiment. I once had a patient who was in bed and his urine was dark colored. He clearly had a kidney infection and it was quite serious and he didn't want to get out of bed, but I wanted to get the right information and he wasn't giving me much information. So I asked him to get out of bed. Put something cold from the refrigerator on you. How does that feel? How does it feel taking off the covers? Go outside. How does that feel? And he didn't want to do that. I even had him jump up and down. But he didn't want to do that. But we found the right remedy, and he was really happy that he had experimented. He wasn't feeling good. It wasn't easy. But it was very important to cure his kidney, and we cooperated together and found it. I was very impressed. While you're talking to a person, you can find out that they are doing something that is really not good for them. For example, you're asking about blankets and you discover that they're using an electric blanket. Well, the nerves all function based on chemical differences that are plus and minus. So they're electronic signals. If they're also using an electronic blanket, that's creating confusion in their own bodies. And if they have any kind of chronic disease, that probably is not good for them. You should take some time during the interview to talk about the problem. You don't have to talk about it in the height of talking about the questionnaire, but you should mark it as something that needs to be discussed because it's important for their health. Okay, next we're going to talk about body positions. And here we're talking about the whole body or parts of the body, but body positions. And all animals need to have some stillness to survive. So when you are not feeling good, how you use your stillness is always a survival issue. Sometimes you need to compare symptoms that are in different parts of the checklist. You see the numbers here. They're quite far apart. The lying position, even during the day, feels better or worse. And while resting, you feel better or worse. This is about the position, and this is about movement or staying still. So you have to actually even talk to the patient. What is the issue? You need to lie down. Is it that you need to stay still? That you need to not move? Or is it the lying down position that is better or worse? most people, you can talk to them about it, and most people are happy to discuss their problem because actually no one else is interested in their problem in this detailed way, unless they're very sick and too weak to talk. Of course, use common sense. Dr. Fry says not to distinguish too sharply between the left and the right side if it seems arbitrary. If someone says, I don't like to sleep on my left side, I sleep on my right side, and then you ask, is there any other reason for that? Oh, I don't like to face the wall when I sleep. Oh, that's an arbitrary reason. It has nothing to do with the rest of their body. Okay? But I have a sore knee, and that sore knee is unrelated to my problem, but I avoid sleeping on that side. Oh, this is also another one of those not a good idea to use this condition, because the sore knee is unrelated to their problem, to their main complaint. It may be important that they have a sore knee, and you may want to check on that more, but at least in terms of the main complaint, if the sore knee is unrelated, then it's quite arbitrary which side they sleep on. Now, the difference between these two questions, to me, seems pretty arbitrary. I think one was better or worse, and the other one was likes to or something. It made some sense. But if two questions seem too similar and your patient is very tired and very sick, often it's not necessary to quibble about small detail. You can turn the symptom on and off and see how it affects the patient. So as you're doing this, you're taking notes at the same time, and you might want to note that it could be either one, and then you need to not to get too involved in choosing which one it should be. You don't want two symptoms saying the same thing. So if your patient can't handle the level of detail that differentiating between these requires, just back off. It may not matter, or you may want to have them experiment. It kind of depends on how many rubrics you've been able to find. Now, all of these three are different, and these are very easy to ask your patient to try and see what's different. This one and this one are about position, and they're kind of contrasting position. But this one is about movement. So you need to differentiate when you're in the position category and the movement category. We talked about a similar one before. In the beginning, I was a little bit confused about this because they often seem the same. And actually the mistake I was making was I wasn't seeing that position and movement were very different issues. So we're going into the movement area. Movement can be essential to survival. This man is diving into a pool when he's being chased by a tiger. Presumably the tiger doesn't swim as well as he does. I hope so. Okay, so here these three are a little bit different. Movement that's not something like sports. It's not restlessness. It's train movement. This is movement in general. Okay? So they're somewhat different. They're right next to each other, but they're somewhat different. And moving the affected part, whatever part hurts. Could be moving your eyes if the eyes are the problem. But this one has to do with physical effort. And sometimes it's a little bit hard to explain this to a patient if they're having a hard time moving and just any movement hurts. You can't differentiate. Well, you sometimes have to give up, especially if they're elderly, and there's just, you have to guess or turn them off and on. You can't always get the answer from the patient, and sometimes you're guessing. These two are similar, but one is raising the affected limb. It could be the leg or the foot or the finger even, and stretching it. Stretching is a different motion. So try to wrap your head around that. Again, this is the bending forward. And bending forward from a sitting position is different than bending forward from a standing position. Here, this is a matter of timing. After rising from a seat and while rising from a seat. These are not the same. Rising from the bed where you were lying down. Often you've been lying down for a while, so you've been still, and then getting up. These are different kinds of situations. This one is, he's going to sit. He's going to be sitting. They're kind of obviously different. I've left out many of them. I'm just looking for the ones that have slight nuance to them. Many of them are too obvious to talk about. While writing, the hands get cramped and the hands get tired. Something like playing the piano or knitting or anything you do fine with your hands could be substituted for writing. And you could actually ask the patient to write and see how writing is instead of asking the question. That's a kind of experiment. These two are always a little bit confusing for me because traveling and bouncing up and down can be hurting something that hurts because of the bouncing up and down. And stomping can also cause, for instance, a joint to hurt, or a part of the body that rubs against another part of the body. There are various scenarios. Of course, they're quite different. But when you get one of them and then you get the other one also, you sometimes need to think, are they related? Are we talking about the same thing, or are we talking about something different? Is this one actually a problem with joints and having nothing to do with motion sickness or being sensitive to the regular rhythm of the car bouncing you around versus you making your body bounce? And often you have to even act it out like I am now. It helps patients. The next area is special senses. And here we're talking about perception. There are many senses on the face. But he selects only the vision and touching as the special senses that are very useful. I'm talking about Dr. Fry. So he's talking about artificial bright lights being problematic. I'm a little astounded by this because I guess if you were in Bowenhausen's day, maybe you're talking about looking at a fire because people had fire in their houses, something like that. But this is different from natural sunlight. And you have to remember that Bowenhausen was the one who created these, so you have to use a little of imagination to imagine what he meant. Also, Bowenhausen had no computer, so straining your vision, I can imagine that in old houses in Bowenhausen's day, the lighting could be very, very poor, and straining your vision would be very easy just because the lighting is poor. Not the situation of a computer, but today most people are straining their vision because of something like a computer or a phone. This kind of straining your vision physically is somewhat different from problems with reading. but he means that you're having problems with vision. Dyslexia is actually a mental problem, but they all kind of go together, and you don't have to distinguish between them, even though they're quite different in my sense of vision. Touching that he's talking about is not you touching something else. It's more about being touched by someone else. And this aversion to being touched could be very psychological. It's not only a physical reaction. Being touched lightly is very different from pressure on the body that's stronger. And again, it's different than rubbing. I find that, for instance, elderly people really like this topic because they have lots of feelings about being touched. And in some cases, people have never thought about this. Nobody ever asks you this kind of question. How do you feel? So I know some people who are just thrilled that I'm asking this question because it does matter to them. They're touched a lot and they have feelings about that. I'm back here again wearing different clothes because this is 3 days later, and I hope you are also watching these videos at your leisure. It's a bit much to watch all of them all at once. But if you're really determined to learn polarity analysis, you probably are interested in exactly how to use the checklist, especially if you've never done homeopathy before. So the head is divided between the physical head and what's happening inside the head with the brain, and finally with the mouth. So squeezing of the head is something that happens if you put on this kind of a wrap on your head, or a hat. Teething is the teething of a baby, and sneezing is a kind of jarring of the head. We had before stomping around or riding around in a car, bumping up and down. These are all related, and so you kind of want to check back and see what is the issue. Is this really just about the head, or is it the whole body? Which rubric would be more appropriate, you would be thinking. And then shaking the head is another one. Okay, so those are all very physical reactions to the head. Many of them you could try directly with the patient. In contrast to the physical aspects, we have kind of confusion or panic, weakness, so you can't think. And that is contrasted with problems with speaking that have to do with the mouth and the operation of the tongue, the lips. There are many different kinds of speech defects. I think some of them are kind of emotional, and you might have to differentiate between them, but you don't have to make such an exact science out of it. If, for instance, if you ask the person to stick out their tongue, and they can't stick it out much, they may have trouble using their tongue. So you can kind of guess which one to use. Are they, if they're having physical problems, it's this rubric. Now we're coming to the mouth. We just talked about the mouth, but this all has to do with eating. And the word fasting in homeopathy always means not eating. So before breakfast, presumably you've been sleeping, and so you have not been eating, so you've been fasting. It's a kind of a natural consequence. So these two rubrics are different, and this one has to do with immediately after breakfast, you're better or worse. And this one is 30 minutes later. So the two are somewhat different. On the website, I don't think this differentiation is made clearly. I found out about this by listening to lectures and such. The intellect has to do with talking and reading and writing and thinking. But swallowing and chewing, and eating and drinking, reactions to food, these are all physical. Some of your reactions to food might be emotional, but people will generally talk about them in terms of some kind of physical reactions, allergies, that sort of thing. Changes of appetite usually have very clear answers. People have hunger or no hunger. But I've had problems when the person can't decide whether they're hungry or not. They don't seem to know how they feel. And if they're very unclear, I tend not to use that rubric unless I absolutely have to, because I don't have much else. And in that case, the remedy would have to be somebody who doesn't know how they feel. It's part of the mental, emotional description of that remedy. Now, swallowing and chewing is difficult, all have to do with the physical mouth, right? Eating before, during, and after, this is about the timing of the problem. This is often very, very useful. The appetite changes. Sometimes people don't know if their appetite has changed or not. They're not that aware. So you have to talk about a little bit. And sometimes you've talked about it, and then at the end of the interview, they'll tell you, oh, yes, I have a problem. And they'll kind of realize it later. Desire to drink. Sometimes people don't actually have a desire to drink. There's a kind of a hydration movement, and they tell you that they're drinking 4 quarts of water or something ridiculous. And you have to ask them, are you thirsty for this water, or is this what people have been telling you you should do? If they tell you, actually, I'm not thirsty at all, but I drink this much water because I don't think I drink enough, according to what other people are telling me. That's a very contaminated answer, because they're actually following the directions of someone else, and they're not telling you how they themselves feel. Now, the temperature of foods, whether it's hot or cold, is usually very distinct. People usually have a very clear idea of what temperature they like. But be careful, because if you've got a very cold person or a very hot person, then that affects their feelings about foods. And if, for instance, they're very cold, but they like cold foods, that's a very strong symptom, because that's kind of weird. And vice versa, if they're very hot people and they like hot foods and they don't like being hot, they're too hot, then that's a very distinct symptom. It's the peculiar symptoms. Considering the situation, is it peculiar? All through homeopathy, this is a major way of deciding if a symptom is important. Okay, so if the person is generally cold and they like warm drinks, and I don't put too much emphasis on that. If I need that rubric, because I don't have many, I'll use it. But I might, if I have all kinds of indications that they're very, very, very cold people, of course they like warm drinks. I'm much more interested in the peculiar kinds of symptoms. So that's very much a judgment call on the part of the homeopath. Aggravates when, before or after drinking, before, while, or after eating. So you can kind of think about those as a set, right? The general question would be, when do you have trouble eating or drinking? When in the process? If he has it highlighted with yellow, of course you have to ask directly. But that's an indirect way of kind of asking a lot of questions. And if they say, oh, absolutely, doesn't matter, whenever I can eat, I don't have any problems drinking or eating ever, well, then you're not going to investigate that very deeply because they've just told you that they have no problems. The next area we're going to look at is the circulation of air. In the body, the circulation of air is of course, the respiratory system. He asks about the taking in of air and the exhalation of air. I was surprised because most people, when they are having trouble with breathing, they can very clearly tell you which is more difficult. If you've never had trouble with breathing, this would seem kind of maybe not so obvious, but if you're having trouble, this is a very, very obvious question. He has given us some normal values, very much like the pulse that he gives us. You can measure pretty well. I'm not a very good counter, and so I usually measure in 15-second intervals. And you can actually look up a clock on the internet, a stopwatch on the internet, and it'll tell you every 15 seconds it'll ring a bell, and you can easily, without even looking at a watch, you can measure breath. I usually count on my fingers, and it's not that difficult. But when breathing is a problem, again, people know when their speed of breath changes. It bothers them a lot. So if you get the kind of vague answer, it's very likely that this rubric doesn't matter much and you don't have to go to all this trouble to measure. I'm not sure when you'd have to measure. I mean, when breathing is difficult, it's a life-threatening, or people feel it's a life-threatening problem. They're not vague about their description. The circulation of blood is another important form of circulation. He does it by measuring the pulse. There are two places that are easy to measure the pulse in the clinic. It's easy to hold the wrist of the patient and put two fingers around the wrist, or do it this way. Either way is fine. But another easy place to measure is underneath the jaw here. I personally find that to be it's a bigger vein, and it's really easy to locate. Neither of them is very difficult. Gives you some normal pulses. People are not quite as aware of this as the breath, at least in my experience. But probably if they have problems with their heart, they really are much more aware of it. So the third kind of circulation is the digestive waste. One thing he's looking at is the distended abdomen. And if you have a lot of gas in your system, that is, your digestion is not going very well, it's usually a liver problem, then the gas either comes out from the bottom or from your mouth. And the one from your mouth is called, in homeopathy language, eructation. The opposite end is called flatus. It's a good idea to know that these exist, because if you don't have a computer program, when you look up fart, you're not going to get flatus in an ordinary index, in Murphy's index, for example. So it might be a good idea to know these two words. And the word also distended is the word for too much air in the abdomen. The abdomen actually blows up. And the third area is the circulation of urine, and interestingly, sexual energy. I was always curious about this word, urogenital. Why do you put the urinary section with the genital section? Are they related? It doesn't seem like urination and sexuality are related in my simple mind. And then you have all these things that have to do with female menstruation. Why are they together? Or sexual instinct? Why is that with urine? Well, actually, I'll tell you the reason, because I just thought it's so interesting. You don't need to know this, but in the fetus, in the baby before it develops into something that you would recognize as a human being, the brain is the first thing to develop. It starts as a ball, right? And then it turns kind of inside out like a sock. The bottom of the ball is the brain, and then after that the spinal cord develops. After that, quite a bit later, the kidney develops from the brain, and then it goes down the entire body to the place where our kidneys are. It's very closely related to the brain because it develops from brain tissue. From the kidneys, all of the sexual organs develop. They develop afterward. Obviously, for survival, the fetus doesn't need a kidney. They're not urinating at all. Maybe they do need a brain. So the most important things develop first, and the things that are less important develop later. And furthermore, these very important organs migrate down the body. I thought that was so interesting. I just couldn't get over it. If you are asking people about sexual instinct, you first should ask for permission to ask about this kind of subject. And you can kind of tell who's going to have problems. For instance, when you mentioned fart or flatus to the patient, if that brought a very embarrassed, drawing reaction, probably sexuality also will bring the similar kind of reaction. So in that case, I advise you to be careful. You might want to ask for permission, or you just might want to skip it. If they seem kind of like they don't want to talk about anything personal, anything to do with their hidden parts of their body, then if you have enough rubrics, definitely be conservative. You don't have to take risks. And how many is enough rubrics? I'm going to talk about that in another video. But you can decide whether this is an area which you should be asking this particular patient about. Once you get to know the patient, this kind of information comes out much more easily. Then we have emotion and intellect as a final category in this 100+ questionnaire. I had a little bit of a hard time understanding the questions on the website. Funny, I watched some videos and I decided that what he really means is the irritability that he describes here. If it's unusual for that patient, then you're supposed to mark that. These two rubrics are kind of related. Solitude, wanting to be alone when you're ill. Personally, I think that's kind of natural, but it's not natural for some patients. Phosphorus wants to be with other people always when they're ill. Lycopodium wants somebody else in the other room. They're not like me, but you have to kind of get a sense of, yeah, people have this emotion, and so in that case, that this kind of a rubric would be useful. And then people who do not want the company of other people. One is whether they want it or not. The other one is, does their state improve if they're alone? Is that a easier way to be when you're sick? So these are slightly different, although they look similar. People don't want to be comforted. Nat Muir is very famous for not wanting to be comforted. I actually, when I was younger, I didn't realize that some people didn't want to be comforted. It just was out of my own experience. So when you learn about that, then you suddenly realize, oh, this is very characteristic of this person. That's very useful. Okay. Now the next one doesn't seem to fit in this area. It's grinding the teeth while you're asleep. Bruxism is what the dentists say. But what happens is the teeth become flat, and people wear guards, plastic guards on their teeth to prevent this. And also their jawbone begins to hurt. They can develop headaches. And Dr. Fry asks you to have some kind of proof, like somebody else can hear them grinding their teeth. Of course, not everybody sleeps with someone else. So you might be able to use these other checks to see if they have grinding of the teeth. And I think what grinding of the teeth expresses is tension, some kind of suppressed tension, where it's like having bad dreams. They can't express their tension, and so it comes out in grinding of the teeth. The final symptom is comprehending things, difficulty. And we had an earlier symptom called mental effort aggravates. I think the two are different because one is the mind is very slow. It's comprehending slowly. And the other one is, if you're sick, then you become worse with being able to think. You could actually not be a very smart person, but when you get sick, you're even worse. You can compare these two rubrics. Okay, this has been Ellen Madono from Tokyo Homeopathy, and we've been talking about the details of using the checklist. The goal is to make this checklist your list in polarity analysis. I hope you can press the subscribe button and give me a like. If you're really interested in this, I have questionnaires that you can print out, and it can help you with your polarity analysis. But you have to contact me. We're studying this in a study group and actually going over cases, and you could join us if you're interested. Thank you for joining us today.